The departure from Busby camp marks the beginning of the final, controversial phase of the Custer campaign, a chapter in history that has fueled debates and conflicting interpretations for over 137 years. While the events leading up to the march from Busby are generally well understood, the moments following the troops' movement on the evening of June 24, 1876, have become a focal point of contention. From the time they left at sunset until the Sioux and Cheyenne finally departed the area on the evening of June 26, nearly every detail has been scrutinized and disputed by historians and eyewitnesses alike. Custer's order to move was given at 11 p.m., though this time has been subject to differing interpretations. According to several key figures, Fred Benteen, Marcus Reno, George Herendeen, Captain Miles Moylan, Luke Hare, Carlo Di Rudio, and Nick Wallace, the column began its march at 11 p.m. However, it's important to note that, in local time, this would have been closer to 10:03 p.m., revealing the complexity of reconciling differing accounts. Nick Wallace, one of the notable voices in the historical record, initially recorded the start of the march as 1 a.m. in his January 1877 report. However, by the time of the Reno inquiry in 1879, he had revised his statement to more closely match the accounts of others, changing the time to 11 p.m. This alteration underscores the challenges of piecing together accurate timelines, as even eyewitnesses struggled to maintain consistency across years of reflection and inquiry. In the end, the precise time of the column's departure may never be agreed upon definitively, yet it stands as one of many details that add layers of complexity to the broader mystery of the Battle of Little Bighorn and the final days of the Custer campaign. Each testimony adds nuance to the historical record, reflecting the fragmented nature of memory and the difficulty in achieving a clear consensus on such a pivotal event. The darkness that enveloped the night of June 24 raises valid questions about how anyone could have recorded the time with such precision. Given the conditions, perhaps the light from a few campfires offered some visibility, but even then, it's difficult to imagine anyone clearly checking the hour. It's plausible that Custer gave the order for the march at 11 p.m., with the regiment beginning to move shortly afterward. Those positioned farther back in the column may have experienced a slight delay, perceiving the start as later. Ed Godfrey and Fred Gerard, for instance, both suggested that the actual departure occurred closer to 11:30 p.m. This range of opinions makes 11 p.m. seem like a reasonable estimate, with the entire command likely on the move by 11:30 or 11:45 p.m. While this variation may seem small, it reflects the difficulty of pinpointing exact moments during such a chaotic night. In contrast, John Gray, in his detailed analysis, proposed that the departure happened later, around 12:30 a.m. However, this theory seems to lack the necessary evidence to be widely accepted. Gray's meticulous search for accuracy raises an important question. Does compromising on smaller details, like the timing of events, really contribute to uncovering the truth? When dealing with an event as contentious and heavily debated as the Custer campaign, seeking precision is essential, but not at the cost of straying too far from the available evidence. Ultimately, while the exact time of departure remains uncertain, the general consensus places the beginning of the march somewhere between 11 o'clock and 11:30 p.m., with the movement of the entire column likely completed by 11:45. These estimates, though not perfect, offer a practical framework for understanding the unfolding of events on that fateful night. Benteen's account, which estimates it took around an hour and a half to cross Muddy Creek and places the completion of this task at 12:30 a.m. or 11:33 p.m. local time, supports the idea that the actual march began shortly after 11 p.m. This timeline seems consistent with other observations. What seems fairly certain is that the march from Busby camp to the first halt covered a distance of approximately 6.2 to 6.7 miles, depending on the exact starting and stopping points. The terrain along the route, though difficult in parts, was mostly manageable, involving a gradual ascent from 2,340 feet to around 4,000 feet as they moved toward the divide, located 11.5 miles away. Given the challenging geography and the length of the column, it's easy to see how timing discrepancies could have arisen, as those positioned farther back may have experienced the march differently from those at the front. Ultimately, the variety of timing accounts likely stems from the varying perspectives within the column itself. Yet, the general consensus remains that the march started shortly after 11 p.m., with the column progressing steadily despite the uneven terrain and logistical challenges. Approximately 640 men, including 605 soldiers, departed from Busby camp en route to the divide, a figure that excludes scouts such as Varnum, Boyer, Reynolds, and others. The troops moved in a column of twos, a standard formation for 1876, with the line stretching nearly 2/3 of a mile. This calculation doesn't even take into account the 175 pack mules, which added at least another 500 feet to the column. Some scholars propose that the mules were driven in an orderly line, similar to the soldiers, while others suggest the animals moved in a less organized fashion. However, the idea of the pack animals moving in a disorganized mass seems improbable, especially given the rugged terrain, the limited number of civilian packers, and the pitch-black conditions of the night. Frustrated by the repeated delays, Benteen suggested a potential solution to First Lieutenant William Weiner Cook, but Cook chose not to pass it along to Custer. The following day, however, Benteen approached Custer directly, and to his surprise, Custer was open to the idea. Benteen's method, which involved positioning companies in front, alongside, and behind the mules, helped to some extent, although the animals remained difficult to manage. Despite the adjustment, the mules continued to be a constant source of trouble, adding to the challenges of the march. Implementing this new strategy mitigated many of the issues, at least until Miles Keogh encountered difficulties with the pack train while crossing Mud Creek. The crossing proved to be a significant challenge that delayed the column by about an hour and a half. Benteen described how Keogh, who was in charge of the rearguard, had to supervise the crossing while the rest of the column waited impatiently. Benteen's vivid account suggests it was no easy task. If it took a minute to cross that pack train over the muddy, it took 2 hours. Despite the setback, the column eventually resumed its movement, covering ground at a reasonable pace given the dark conditions. It's likely that the long, stretched-out column varied in speed, sometimes extending between 1 and 3 miles in length as it moved. Assuming the march began at 11 p.m. and halted around 2:15 a.m., the troops covered approximately 6.2 to 6.7 miles at an average speed of roughly 2 miles per hour. The head of the column likely pushed ahead while Keogh and his rearguard struggled with the pack mules. Leading the way was Half Yellowface, a Crow scout, while Gerard and the Scouts were assigned to follow any left-hand trails. Godfrey noted that the thick dust made visibility difficult, and the noise from the equipment and horses drowned out any sounds beyond the immediate area. With limited vision and hearing, the troops relied on the dust cloud ahead to stay on the trail, occasionally pausing to reorient themselves. Although Godfrey's K Company wasn't at the front of the column, he still remarked on how difficult it was to keep the troops together in the dark. Despite these obstacles, the men maintained a trot for most of the march, covering nearly 7 miles. By 2:15 a.m., Custer decided to halt the regiment, realizing they wouldn't be able to reach the divide before daylight. Reports of the exact timing of the halt vary slightly, with some suggesting it occurred as early as 1:30 a.m., while others place it closer to 2:45 a.m. The general consensus is that the column halted before dawn. After resuming the march at 11 p.m., the troops continued until first light, with the horses once again stopping without food. By around 8 to 8:45 a.m., the column started moving again, having covered roughly 10 miles overnight. Time became difficult to track, especially in the darkness, as checking watches was nearly impossible. Perhaps the clearest indication that the column halted around 2:15 a.m. comes from Benteen's observation. He noted that about an hour and a half after they stopped, daylight began to appear. This lines up with the start of nautical twilight, which occurred roughly an hour and 26 minutes later. The timeline suggests the column maintained a steady pace of around 2 miles per hour over a 6.5-mile stretch, aligning well with the conditions they faced. If the timing had been much different, the sequence of events would seem less consistent. This reasoning also helps synchronize Wallace's mention of daylight with the other accounts, offering a more cohesive understanding of the march's progress leading up to dawn. It's important to consider how significant these precise times were to Wallace or others like Hare, Herendeen, or Godfrey. If Wallace couldn't see his watch when the column halted, it would have been just as difficult for him to check it when they began marching around 11 or 11:30 p.m., long after civil twilight had ended. At times, we give these testimonies more weight than they deserve. When Luke Hare mentioned that the column arrived before daylight, he was likely more focused on his surroundings than on the exact time, especially in Pacific time. Historians often strive to pin down exact moments, but Hare's observation suggests that while he may not have known the precise hour, it was certainly before daylight. Nautical twilight began at 2:44 a.m., with watchable light occurring at 3:41 a.m., so it would have still been too dark to read a timepiece clearly during those moments. This adds to the idea that many of these time estimates are rough approximations rather than precise measures. As Hare dismounted and adjusted to the situation, the faint traces of light might have made him realize that the darkness was slowly lifting. During the Reno Court of Inquiry, Captain Moylan was asked about the timing of daylight in that region. His response, "Well, between 2 and 3 o'clock was about daylight," helps align the accounts of Hare, Wallace, and Herendeen with those of Godfrey, Moylan, Benteen, and Reno. Gerard's observations, however, remain the outlier. Custer had specifically instructed Gerard to follow even the smallest trails on the left, which could explain his later arrival as he adhered to these orders. Civil twilight began at 3:34 a.m., well before the 4:13 a.m. sunrise, and long after the first troops arrived at their halt. Historian John Gray's estimate of a 3:15 a.m. halt time suggests the column covered about 7 miles at an average speed of 2.55 miles per hour. This estimate fits reasonably well with the timeline, accounting for the gradual shift from darkness to twilight as the march progressed. Gray's calculation of distance is slightly off by about 0.3 to 0.8 of a mile, but not drastically so. What's intriguing is his use of local time, which, when converted to St. Paul time, suggests a departure at 1:50 a.m. and an arrival at 4:12 a.m. These times seem disconnected from the experiences of those who were actually present during the events. While Gray's figures are close, they appear somewhat forced when compared to Gerard's notes. It seems that Benteen and Moylan were positioned near the front of the regiment, although neither led a company. Moylan's estimate of leaving at 11 p.m. and halting at 1:30 a.m. indicates a pace of about 2.68 miles per hour, which aligns closely with Gray's assessment, even though the specific times differ. Given the overall timeline from 11 p.m. to 2:15 a.m., a slower pace of approximately 1.9 to 2.1 miles per hour appears more realistic, taking into account the conditions and challenges faced during the march. It's unfortunate that we don't have more insight from Keogh, although some fragile evidence suggests his involvement in the events. First Sergeant John Ryan of M Company alluded to the arrangement of the packs, indicating that Companies C and M were under Keogh's command. Additionally, some sources claim that Fred Gerard stated that Half Yellowface and Bloody Knife warned Custer about the challenges of crossing the divide before daylight, cautioning that they would likely be spotted by Sioux scouts. However, it's unclear how Bloody Knife, a Ree who was unfamiliar with the territory, could have had this knowledge. Moreover, claims regarding the assembly at the Busby halt are often taken out of context, highlighting the sloppy scholarship that surrounds this event. According to Gerard, the column departed around 11:30 p.m., and he, along with Half Yellowface and Bloody Knife, moved to the front to await Custer's arrival. When Custer finally arrived, he instructed Gerard to scout far to the left, emphasizing the need for caution as they moved forward. At some point during the march, Custer halted the column, prompting Gerard to send out scouts to locate the trail. While they waited, Custer inquired of the two scouts whether they could cross the divide before daylight, to which they responded negatively. He then asked if crossing in daylight would prevent them from being discovered, and they answered no again. This exchange, as noted by Reno, is said to have occurred around 2 a.m., which aligns with the estimated halt time. However, Reno's timeline has often been scrutinized. While the discussion over timing may seem almost irrelevant in light of the later events, the strongest argument for either side lies in the overall perspective of the scouts' journey. Their trek from Busby Camp to the Crow's Nest was sluggish, taking them over 5 hours to cover barely 2 miles per hour in the thick of night. This delay can be partially attributed to the Crow Scouts pausing for a smoke in the dense brush by the stream. Given that there were still hours of darkness ahead, it seems there wasn't a pressing urgency to hasten their pace. When they reached the Crow's Nest, Varnum, Boyer, and White Man Runs Him took the horses into a hollow. While most of the scouts rested and waited for dawn, Harry Moccasin and White Man Runs Him climbed to the summit. As civil twilight approached around 3:30 a.m., the two Crow scouts noticed what appeared to be the faint glow of campfires against the early morning sky and hurried back to report their findings. Varnum, suffering from sore eyes due to lack of sleep and dust from the ride, had difficulty seeing clearly from the heights. Additionally, two abandoned teepees were spotted along Ash or Reno Creek, likely observed through telescopes since they were several miles away. Varnum quickly jotted down a note containing this information and handed it to Red Star, a young Ree, to deliver to Custer. However, discrepancies begin to emerge at this point. Smalley claimed the note was sent around 3:45 a.m., while others suggest it was closer to 4 a.m. Interestingly, Varnum himself later stated that he dispatched the messengers just after 5 a.m. This variance in timelines adds further complexity to the narrative surrounding their movements and observations that morning. This perspective aligns with the understanding of how long it typically takes for visibility to improve at dawn. Around 5 o'clock, Varnum recounted that he wrote a note to the general, noting that while sunrise was officially at 4:13 a.m., it likely felt much later from their elevated position. Given Varnum's exhaustion and sleep deprivation, it seems improbable that he could accurately discern much before dawn, particularly when faced with the difficulty of identifying details in the hazy, dim light of early morning. This suggests that he may have preferred not to report anything prematurely without a clear certainty, despite the Crow Scouts' insistence on what they had seen. This incident underscores how little emphasis was placed on exact times during the campaign. Varnum, seasoned by frontier life, had likely internalized general sunrise patterns and wasn't reliant on his watch to dictate his actions. His reference to 5 o'clock may well have been based on military headquarters time, which would have corresponded to around 4 or even 3 a.m. local time, still too dark for any detailed observations to be made. This confusion over local and headquarters time is a recurring issue throughout the historical records. While Varnum is generally considered a reliable source, his account requires careful interpretation, as it tends to compress events and timings into a historical blur. The journey from the Crow's Nest to Custer's initial halt was approximately 4.5 miles, a trek that could be easily covered in daylight. A fast rider could traverse this distance in less than 45 minutes. However, accounts differ regarding how long it took Red Star to deliver the note. Red Star himself claimed that, despite his companion's horse going lame, he pressed on with urgency, fully aware of the importance of his mission. As a young man, likely between 18 and 22 years old, this task represented a badge of honor for him, illustrating the trust that the white soldiers placed in him. Upon his arrival, he was warmly greeted by his fellow Reese, who understood the significance of what he had accomplished. This recognition not only validated his efforts but also highlighted the critical role of indigenous scouts in the broader context of the campaign.
Writers like Jack Pennington and James Woolard lend credibility to Red Star's account, noting that he observed the sun's position upon reaching Custer's camp around 6 a.m. If Varnum sent the note around 5, it seems reasonable to believe that Red Star arrived at Custer's location by 6, especially considering his determination to press on despite the setback with Bull's horse. Meanwhile, Varnum's scouts soon spotted Sioux warriors about 1.5 miles to the west, moving toward the soldiers' camp. Concerned that the Sioux might see the smoke from their campfires and reveal the soldiers' position, Varnum quickly organized a small group to intercept the approaching warriors. However, just as they set off, they were called back. The Sioux had changed their direction. The scouts then observed as the Sioux crossed the divide, altering their course once again, this time moving toward a gap in the terrain. In the midst of these developments, Red Star reportedly arrived at camp, delivering the critical news of the Sioux camp's discovery. This sequence of events underscored the tension and urgency of the situation, highlighting the vital role of communication and reconnaissance in the unfolding drama of the campaign. It's fascinating to observe Red Star's seemingly nonchalant attitude regarding Bull's lame horse, which further bolsters his account of hurrying back with the message. White Man Runs Him claims that Custer reached the Crow's Nest by 6 a.m., implying that Red Star indeed moved quickly. While Indian time, when translated into Western terms, can often be imprecise, Red Star's description of events aligns well with known distances and timings. If we calculate his journey, it's plausible he trotted at around 7 miles per hour, allowing for occasional pauses to check on Bull. His account suggests a sense of urgency, tempered with a realistic pacing. Moreover, there is anecdotal evidence indicating that Red Star first spoke with Bloody Knife upon arriving at the camp. This interaction caught the attention of Isaiah Dorman, the Dakota interpreter, who then alerted Private John Berkman to wake Custer. After receiving Varnum's note and hearing Red Star's account, Custer and his men, along with his brothers Tom and Boston, prepared to move toward the crow's nest. This series of events not only highlights the importance of communication in the unfolding situation but also illustrates how indigenous scouts played a crucial role in relaying critical information during the campaign. The note provided crucial confirmation of the Sioux camp's location, prompting Custer, who was known for his capacity to function on minimal sleep, to act swiftly. He ordered his men to prepare for movement. By approximately 7:20 a.m. local time, which translates to 8:17 a.m. headquarters time, Custer was likely rousing his troops for the final push. However, the absence of formal orders and trumpet calls has sparked debate. While some soldiers reported hearing the trumpet signaling the call to action, others, including Benteen, claimed they did not hear it at all. This discrepancy underscores the chaotic nature of the situation and the varying perceptions among the men as they prepared for what lay ahead. Red Star's account of events, along with the timing of his ride, aligns well with other credible sources, though careful consideration of local versus headquarters time is necessary to accurately match the sequence of events. Overall, Red Star's swift return and the subsequent movements of Custer's men fit within the established timeline of that fateful morning. Lieutenant Godfrey remarked that they began marching promptly at 8 a.m. and continued without stopping until 10:30 a.m. when they paused in a ravine, having covered approximately 10 miles. However, this claim raises questions. While the timing matches with other accounts, his assertion of covering 10 miles suggests a pace of 4 miles per hour, which seems implausible and casts doubt on the accuracy of his entire account. In reality, the first halt was only about 4.5 miles from the crow's nest, and the second halt, where the march concluded, was just 3.5 miles further, making the total distance significantly shorter than Godfrey's estimate. It seems that Godfrey, reflecting on these events some 15 years later, might have misremembered the distance, possibly conflating different moments in his recollection. Other officers, like Miles Moylan, confirmed the 8 a.m. departure, while Luke Hare provided a broader estimate, suggesting they left sometime between 8 o'clock and 9 a.m. George Wallace's account also fluctuated. He initially stated the time was between 8 o'clock and 8:45 before settling on 8:45 during the Reno inquiry. These discrepancies are intriguing, especially for someone responsible for maintaining a precise itinerary. Benteen, another officer, recalled traveling about a mile and a half before the next halt, which adds to the confusion when compared to Godfrey's figures. Were they even describing the same events? One perplexing theory from historian Vern Smalley posits that Custer never actually ascended to Crow's Nest. Instead, Smalley suggests that Custer observed the valleys from a lower vantage point, which he refers to as Varnum's Lookout. In a letter dated July 9, 1925, Graham reached out to Varnum and Edgerly regarding an alleged 45-minute halt that Custer supposedly made after sending a message to Benteen, during the time Reno's troops were engaged. Varnum dismissed the notion, stating, "Anyone who knew G.O.A. Custer would find it hard to believe he could sit still for 5 minutes in that situation." Edgerly also expressed skepticism about the plausibility of such a pause. This tendency for impatience was a defining characteristic of Custer's command style, as highlighted by General Alured Bayard Nettleton, a Civil War peer of Custer. Nettleton lauded Custer for his ability to make swift decisions, noting how he could inspire his troops with what he termed a thunderbolt of energy during combat, an ability that he consistently demonstrated throughout the war. These descriptions, swift, impulsive, and dynamic, create a vivid image of a commander who would not merely saunter up to Crow's Nest but instead charge ahead with urgency, leaving his regiment in his wake. The timeline of events leading up to Custer's arrival at Crow's Nest reflects a certain disarray. After Red Star arrived around 6:55 a.m., there was a brief moment of celebration and casual conversation among the scouts. By 7:05 a.m., the interpreter Isaiah Dorman spotted Red Star in the Scouts' camp and promptly sent Private John Berkman to awaken Custer. By 7:20 a.m., Custer was still shaking off the remnants of sleep and making his way to the Scouts' camp. Upon discussing the situation and reviewing Varnum's note, Custer was prepared to take action by 7:45 a.m. Orders were being issued and preparations were underway by 8 a.m. True to his impatient nature, Custer set off by 8:10 a.m., covering the ground to Crow's Nest with a brisk pace and reaching the lookout area by 8:35 a.m. The location of Crow's Nest was easily identifiable, especially for those who followed the tracks along the south edge of Davis Creek Valley, as Varnum had done. As Custer approached, Varnum descended from the hill to greet him while the horses were being corralled. By around 9 a.m., Custer was peering out at the Little Bighorn Valley through his eyeglass, yet the signs of a village seemed to leave him largely unimpressed. In a letter to Walter Camp written years later in 1909, Varnum recalled how he, Custer, Tom Custer, and Lieutenant James Calhoun engaged in discussions about the previous night's events while scouting the area together. However, Varnum's recollections appear somewhat muddled, as he later omitted Calhoun from his memoirs, raising questions about the accuracy of his account. Despite these inconsistencies, Custer's independent nature was unmistakable. He frequently rode ahead of the main column, scouting on his own while the rest of his regiment struggled to keep pace. As Custer scouted from Crow's Nest, the rest of the regiment trudged along at a slow pace, hindered by stubborn pack mules and confusion among the officers. The march was characterized by disorganization and a lack of clear direction. Officers like Lieutenant Cook, Major Reno, and Captain Benteen found themselves uncertain about the overall plan, while Custer forged ahead on his own. This lack of coordination left the main body of troops struggling to keep up with their leader's pace and resolve. Red Star's brief remark about Custer going to meet the troops lends further support to the officer's accounts, hinting at Custer's eagerness to rejoin his men and solidify their plans. This eagerness was characteristic of Custer, who thrived on action and was known to make rapid decisions in the heat of the moment. Yet, the slow advance of the regiment underlined the tension between Custer's independent scouting and the group's struggles to coordinate effectively. The juxtaposition of Custer's decisive movements against the backdrop of the regiment's disarray painted a vivid picture of the command's difficulties as they approached a pivotal moment in their campaign. The confusion and delays among the officers served as a poignant reminder of the challenges inherent in leadership during such tumultuous times. This situation casts doubt on some of Varnum's recollections. A notable example of potential inaccuracies in Varnum's post-battle memories is the story of Robert Jackson, a re-scout. Eyewitness accounts vary regarding this critical moment. Moylan noted that the halt occurred at the foot of the divide, while Hare described the column as remaining concealed about half a mile from the divide for approximately an hour, somewhere between 10 a.m. and noon. Varnum, on the other hand, stated that the column reached the divide around 10 a.m. These discrepancies highlight the challenges historians face in establishing an accurate timeline and understanding the movements of Custer's command on that fateful day. Each account contributes to a broader understanding of the events, yet the variations also underscore the difficulties of reconstructing historical moments with precision, especially when dealing with the complexities of command and the vastness of the landscape. Private Theodore Golden recounted that after marching for 2 hours beginning at 8 a.m., the regiment sheltered in a ravine at the base of the divide, where they remained hidden for some time. Edgerly added that the regiment had halted by 10 a.m., approximately 15 miles from the Indian village, while Custer was scouting from a hill alongside the Crow and Ree-scouts. This lends credence to the McDougal Ravine theory. However, it's likely that Custer's column made multiple stops along the way, utilizing natural cover in various ravines from this location to areas behind Crow's Nest. At this stage, Custer had received reports from his scouts regarding a significant village nearby. Charlie Reynolds, Mitch Boyer, and the Crow Scouts all confirmed the village's existence, yet Custer remained skeptical. His doubt reflects his cautious nature, especially in the face of conflicting information, suggesting that despite the scouts' confidence, he felt compelled to verify the reports through his own observations. This hesitance could have played a role in the decision-making process as Custer weighed the credibility of his scouts against the backdrop of an already tense and uncertain situation. From his vantage point atop Crow's Nest, Custer failed to identify any clear indications of the encampment, despite his scouts' firm assurances that the village was substantial. This skepticism did not resonate well with his officers, who had a differing viewpoint. The group convened for a brief meeting, during which an officer's call was sounded. Among those present was Private Peter Thompson, who later recounted that everyone appeared intensely focused on addressing a critical problem. He observed that while Custer and the more seasoned officers dominated the conversation, the younger officers remained notably silent. Thompson's depiction of the scene seems accurate, particularly given the geographical features he described. The landscape in the upper reaches of Davis Creek Valley aligns with his account, with Crow's Nest forming the southern corner and intermittent streams cascading down from the mountains. Today, a four-wheel drive trail traces the ravine referenced by Dr. Fox, crossing into the next valley. This physical terrain not only shapes our understanding of the events that unfolded but also highlights the strategic challenges Custer faced in interpreting the landscape and making decisions based on incomplete information. As the path meanders into Davis Creek, it veers westward, hugging the base of Crow's Nest Hill, likely the very spot where Thompson noted the officers congregating. Despite receiving reports from multiple scouts, Custer remained unconvinced that any enemy village lay within view. He voiced skepticism, questioning whether even the Indians themselves could see their camp from that distance. In stark contrast, Girard was resolute in his belief in the scouts, recalling distinct signs of a village: pony herds, dust clouds, and dark masses along the riverbank. Fred Benteen shared this confidence in the keen eyesight of the Indian scouts, emphasizing that his experiences on the plains had taught him to trust their observations over the limited perspectives offered by binoculars. The accumulated evidence and consensus among the scouts began to form a compelling case for the presence of a village. However, Custer's skepticism lingered, creating tension within the ranks. Adding to the day's complexities, Custer learned of the incident involving Sergeant Curtis, whose pack had been raided by Cheyenne warriors. This incident underscored the immediacy of the threat they faced, as well as the potential for heightened conflict. The mix of doubt and mounting evidence created a precarious atmosphere as Custer continued to deliberate on the best course of action, torn between his instincts and the insights of those around him. Mitch Boyer, meanwhile, discovered Cheyenne pony tracks in the vicinity, which added yet another layer of complexity to the situation. All indicators suggested that the enemy was well aware of Custer's impending approach. Despite this mounting evidence, Custer reportedly reassured the Crow Scout half-yellow face that their presence had gone unnoticed. However, the Ree Scouts, most notably Red Star and White Man Runs Him, strongly countered this claim. They cautioned Custer that the Sioux had already spotted their dust clouds and campfires, signaling that their cover was compromised. James Willert provides intriguing insight into the mindset of the Crow Scouts during this critical moment. From their perspective, the presence of the enemy necessitated immediate action. For them, waiting for an opportunity or further intelligence was not an option. The only justifiable course of action was to attack. This urgency reflected a broader cultural belief in the necessity of proactive engagement when facing potential threats. The tension between Custer's cautious skepticism and the scouts' insistence on immediate action created a fraught atmosphere, influencing decisions that would have profound consequences for the upcoming confrontation. The decision made by General Gibbon weeks earlier to call off an attack on a village had already sown confusion and disappointment among the scouts. They viewed waiting for nightfall, as Custer had planned, as a significant mistake. Bruce Liddick notes that if they postponed their action, the warriors would likely come out to engage in combat, allowing time for the women and children to escape before everyone scattered. This very scenario, warriors rushing to fight while non-combatants slipped away, was exactly what Custer was trying to prevent. Ironically, despite his strategic efforts and the growing concerns of his officers, this is precisely what unfolded at the Little Bighorn. Lieutenant Godfrey later recounted that the officers shared these apprehensions, but the situation quickly spiraled beyond their control. The warnings from the Crow and Ree scouts proved to be accurate, yet by the time Custer fully grasped the gravity of the situation, it was already too late to alter the course of events. The tension between strategic planning and the chaotic realities of battle ultimately led to a disastrous outcome, highlighting the complexities and unpredictability of military engagements. It is quite rare for a commander to enjoy the luxury of scouting an enemy position in broad daylight, particularly when confronting opponents as elusive and skilled as Native American warriors. Typically, the presence of troops would swiftly alert the indigenous forces, who were highly adept at interpreting the signs left in the wake of their adversaries. These indicators would provide crucial information about the proximity of the troops, enabling the commander to estimate their distance from the enemy. When signs pointed to a hot trail or indicated a close pursuit, the usual response was a forced march, often conducted under the cover of darkness. This strategy aimed to position the troops near the enemy village for a surprise attack at dawn. The element of surprise was vital in these engagements, as commanders frequently had limited knowledge regarding the size of the opposing force, often relying solely on educated guesses gleaned from following the trail. Consequently, plans for attack were often formulated in haste and fraught with uncertainty, with the likelihood of success depending heavily on chance. This high-stakes environment underscored the complexities of warfare during this period, where decisive action was critical, yet often undermined by the unpredictable nature of the battlefield. A daylight approach to enemy territory posed significant dangers, as was almost always the case in such engagements. Historically, once Native American forces became aware of nearby troops, they responded with remarkable speed, employing deceptive tactics to delay the advance. This allowed women, children, and the elderly to escape and scatter into the vast plains, making pursuit in these circumstances nearly impossible. In this type of warfare, swift and decisive action was the norm. Custer's decision to attack was likely solidified by the incident involving Curtis's missing pack, which signaled that their presence had been detected. After a hurried council with Bloody Knife and several of the Ree scouts, many of whom opposed an attack due to the overwhelming number of Sioux, Custer resolved to proceed. Despite the warnings and the council to reconsider, he chose to lean into the decision to attack, believing that the opportunity to engage the enemy was too pressing to pass up. Lieutenant Edgerly recalled that during the meeting, Custer expressed unwavering confidence in his strategy, asserting that they would advance and directly confront the village. He believed that the Indians would not stand their ground against a full regiment of cavalry and that, upon realizing their approach, the native forces would attempt to flee. At one point, Custer borrowed Lieutenant DeRudio's Austrian-made field glasses in a bid to spot the village again. Luke Hare later recounted that while Custer was scouting the valley of the Little Bighorn, his troops remained concealed less than half a mile from the divide. Custer even made a trip back to the Crow's Nest to reassess the situation. Hare did not witness Custer's return from this excursion, but he was informed later that Mitch Boyer had conveyed a significant message to Custer, stating something to the effect of, "General, I've been with these Indians for 30 years, and this is the largest village I've ever seen." This testimony likely contributed to the urgency and determination Custer felt about moving forward with the attack. Hare's statements about Custer's movements may have been somewhat ambiguous. He might have been referring to any high vantage point, not strictly the Crow's Nest. In a letter to Charles Varnum dated February 24, 1910, Camp noted that Hare claimed the regiment halted just east of the divide, approximately a quarter to half a mile away, hidden from view of the Little Bighorn Valley. They remained in this position from around 10 a.m. until nearly noon. DeRudio corroborated this account, adding that during this halt, Custer made a second trip to the Crow's Nest for another look at the area. However, Varnum firmly denied that this second trip ever took place, expressing confidence that Custer did not return to the hill for another observation. Despite Varnum's certainty, the overall situation indicates that both Reynolds and Boyer were keenly aware of the importance of ensuring Custer did not underestimate the size or location of the village. Their eagerness to provide accurate information highlights the tension and urgency surrounding the command's decision-making process at that critical juncture. Varnum also expressed uncertainty regarding Custer's use of Lieutenant DeRudio's superior field glasses, noting that while there was a mention of them, he could not recall Custer actually utilizing them again. This uncertainty may be attributed to Varnum's preoccupation at the time, as he was busy searching for food and water after having missed breakfast, which left him unable to confirm the precise sequence of events. Such distractions likely influenced the timing and dynamics of the officer's call. When Custer finally reconvened with his officers, it's possible he took one last look through DeRudio's field glasses. According to Private Thompson's observations, the officers' council lasted approximately 20 minutes, followed by a brief discussion about the village. From the meeting's location, the divide was about 3/4 of a mile away, and at a canter, it would have taken Custer roughly 8 minutes to reach that vantage point. Factoring in additional time for observation and conversation, he could have returned by around 11:10 a.m. This timeline highlights the potential for decisions made under pressure and the urgency that characterized the moments leading up to the fateful engagement. Whether or not Custer was fully convinced of the village's size, it was likely during this period that he began to formulate his tactical plan. He made assignments, detailing 7 men from each company to manage the packs, with Lieutenant Edward Gustav Matthey overseeing the operation. Matthey's experience in such tasks made him a suitable choice. Meanwhile, Benteen, fully aware that his men were prepared, informed Custer of their readiness to move. As a reward for his swift preparations, Benteen was honored with the task of leading the regiment forward. With the companies that had scattered in the side valleys recalled, the regiment began to make its way toward the divide, though many troops remained stretched out along Davis Creek Valley. Custer then issued the command for the troops to mount up, which, according to Edgerly, took only a minute. By 11:45 a.m., the regiment was advancing, underscoring the urgency of the situation. Given his understanding of Native American warfare, Custer recognized that surprise and speed were critical factors in achieving success. Time was now of the essence, and every moment counted as he led his men toward the impending confrontation. With surprise likely lost, speed became Custer's primary advantage. In every situation, it always came down to speed.